This is a video news release from Recognition PR. Media outlets and social media platforms can use the content copyright-free, provided it's set in appropriate context. Martin Williamson, you are a property lawyer with the law firm Latimer Hinks Solicitors in Darlington. Tell me, what has the government said in relation to housing transactions?
Well, a lot of people will have heard in the media and on the television, and quite a few people will be involved in property transactions themselves at present and have seen the government's guidance, which in simple terms, the government are trying to make sure that the actual move involved in a property transaction is deferred. Essentially, there's no prohibition, there's no attempt by the government to prevent people progressing property transactions, but they don't want to see people physically move, and all the upheaval and the social interaction that might involve, removal companies, close contact and the rest of it. But in truth, there's no prohibition, no restriction on lawyers and others involved in the process progressing transactions.
Now, a lot of people will take the government advice. They're taking government advice, hence the town centres are clear and so on. So assuming that most people involved in moving house do take the government advice, what, if any, are the implications on the legal process and the transaction process, drawing down funds, that kind of thing, the market value and that kind of thing?
Well, essentially, there are two scenarios you've got to look at. The crucial defining point is whether or not an exchange of contracts has taken place. Now, most people will probably appreciate that exchange of contracts happens first. That is the date at which the time at which the transaction becomes binding on the parties, and at that moment they set the date that completion is going to take place, and the move takes place on the completion date. Now, if you have not exchanged contracts, then there's nothing to prevent your lawyers and others involved in the process in progressing the transaction, carrying out searches, raising inquiries, investigating the ownership of the property, and a buyer arranging their mortgage. There's nothing to prevent them doing all of that, all the work that they would normally do up to the point where the legally binding commitment would be given. But this is the important point. You really want to avoid this exchange of contracts, this giving a legally binding commitment that will then bind you to complete your transaction at some point in the future, perhaps a week, couple of weeks away, which is the normal format. Because what could happen, of course, is you could exchange contracts, and then when that completion date comes along, you can't complete, either because, heaven forbid, you've been taken ill, you're having to isolate, somebody else in the process is in the same boat, or some other unforeseen element has prevented the completion. Because, COVID-19 apart, if there is no completion on the completion date, there is a breach of the contract, no matter what the reason is, and we want to avoid that.
Is it possible to have a contract that is contingent?
Yes, it is possible to have a contract that's contingent, but that involves quite a bit of clever drafting, and to make it work is not as immediately straightforward as you might think. A more perhaps practical alternative is for the parties in a transaction to think in terms of exchanging contracts and completing on the same day. This minimizes the risk, because it means that there's no legally binding agreement that the transaction will actually complete and that people have to move until the day itself. So if anybody finds that right at the last minute they're unable to complete, there will be no breach of contract if the completion doesn't take place. The drawback, of course, is obvious. It means that right up until the moment of completion, you don't know for certain that it's going to happen. But having said that, of course, even if there is an exchange of contracts in the current climate, that is still a possibility. So really, the idea of a simultaneous exchange of contracts and completion is perhaps a sensible way of proceeding. And of course, there will be people out there who are familiar with this concept. It happens quite regularly in any event if there are matters that are outstanding right up until the last moment in a transaction.
Two questions
on the way of managing it, perhaps.
Two questions on this. First one, if you have exchange contracts and were about to actually move house, and you can't because of government advice, you are technically in breach of contract. Is there any way of avoiding that? Is it likely that any action will be taken against either party in that scenario?
Yes, well, as I sort of alluded to before, if you don't complete on the completion date, that will amount to a breach of contract, regardless of whether it's something to do with COVID-19, having to isolate, illness, or whatever. So the government's advice, you're quite right, is that people should not physically move when it gets to their completion date. And the advice is that all involved in these circumstances should try and find a way of deferring the completion date. So they will come to some agreement that, although they may perhaps technically be in a position to enforce the contract, they won't. They'll just agree between them a new completion date should be penciled in, or agree perhaps that they will do nothing to try and enforce the contract until the current crisis is over. And this is a situation which we are now having to try and manage.
And will these agreements be ancillary agreements written down, or will they just be verbal gentlemen's agreements?
Well, in some cases, they will be the latter. It would be advisable for them to be the former. In other words, some sort of supplemental agreement, which can be a relatively simple document, agreed between the lawyers to the effect that the completion date has been renegotiated, if you like, to a new date. So yes, it would be advisable to put it in writing, and then that avoids the possibility of anybody perhaps trying to, take advantage of somebody at a later date, or perhaps reneging on what was agreed, or even just misunderstanding about what was agreed when the date was deferred.
Okay, and then Martin, the second question relating to this is, if you haven't gone to exchange of contracts, you're about to pause, as you've said, you pause the exchange of contracts, you exchange and complete on the same day.
Yep.
Are there risks of traffic jams, so to speak? Maybe mortgage lenders that have not got enough officials to process the transfer of funds. Lawyers like yourself, of course, you'll work very hard. You'll make sure you are available. Is there a risk of the system being driven to be over capacity and a lot of sort of snaggles happening as a result of it?
Well, yes, is the short answer to that. There is that risk, and indeed, the Friday that has just passed, there were a number of occasions of this in transactions that my firm handled. One in particular, where a mortgage company, who will remain nameless, had something of a meltdown, and we didn't receive the mortgage funds until 2 days after they were meant to arrive. Now, we managed to manage that, and the reason we managed it is because we hadn't exchanged contracts. So my client didn't end up in breach of contract when they weren't able to complete on the day they had scheduled, or we had scheduled for completion. As soon as the mortgage money arrived, we were able to complete. And thankfully, that was possible because in that scenario, that particular case, nobody was actually moving house or didn't need to move house. But you're quite right. We don't know really at this point the degree to which in weeks to come there will still be functionality in banks, building societies, insurance companies, all of these other elements in the process that you rely on to be able to deliver on a completion date, which really this just highlights this idea of if you're in a chain where this is possible, if you can agree on a completion date that you will all work to, but don't create the legally binding agreement until the day itself, then that provides the escape route if anybody is let down by their mortgage company, the fund's not turning up, or some other unforeseen eventuality.